Part 1, The Dawn of an Empire, Early Foundations, 1500s. Every empire begins with a spark. For Britain the spark came not from vast land armies or ancient dynasties, but from the sea. Small islands in the North Atlantic, battered by storms, shaped by centuries of invasion and conflict, would soon send their ships to the farthest corners of the earth. The 16th century was an age of daring and danger. Spain and Portugal had carved the globe between them. Their galleons carried gold from the Americas and spices from the east. But England, restless and ambitious, longed for its place in this new world order. The Tudor monarchs encouraged sailors and adventurers. Figures like John Cabot, Francis Drake, and Walter Raleigh set forth across the waves, driven by trade, by glory, and by the promise of riches that seemed limitless. Yet the first English ventures were uncertain. Colonies failed in Roanoke. Ships were lost at sea. But slowly patterns formed. A network of exploration grew. And with it a dream began to take shape. That this small kingdom might one day command a global stage. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 sealed England's destiny. For the first time the island nation felt the wind of possibility at its back. The seas that had once hemmed it in now stretched before it as an open highway. Part 2, The Rise of Colonies and the Commercial Empire, 1600s-1700s. The 17th century was the century of expansion. England's merchants founded colonies in North America and the Caribbean. Tobacco from Virginia. Sugar from Barbados. Timber, furs, and fish flowed back across the Atlantic. Plantations grew. And with them a darker trade, the forced labor of enslaved Africans carried in chains across the Middle Passage. In 1600 Queen Elizabeth granted a charter to the East India Company, a private corporation armed with cannons and ships. Its goal, to seize a share of the Asian spice and textile markets. What began as commerce soon became conquest. Ports were fortified. Armies were raised. And slowly the company became a state within a state. Meanwhile wars in Europe spilled overseas. The English fought the Dutch, the French, the Spanish. Every conflict redrew the maps of empire. And by the early 1700s Britain's hold stretched from Hudson Bay to Jamaica, from West Africa to Bengal. This was not yet the empire of legend. But the outlines were clear. A commercial empire of trade, profit, and power. An empire that would soon outgrow every rival. Part 3, Revolution, India, and the Global Empire, late 1700s-1800s. No empire is without crisis. And Britain's came with the loss of its 13 American colonies. The Revolution of 1776 was a wound to imperial pride. The colonies declared independence, rejecting taxation and distant rule. And when Britain's forces withdrew in 1783, many predicted the empire's decline. But the loss of America was not an end. It was a turning point. Freed from the burden of continental rule, Britain turned its gaze further afield. India became the new jewel. The East India Company extended control beyond trade. It ruled vast territories through alliances, armies, and treaties. By the early 1800s, India was no longer just a market but the beating heart of empire. Meanwhile Australia was settled as a penal colony. Canada was reshaped after war with France. Africa became a new frontier for exploration and trade. Everywhere British ships sailed, they carried not just goods but power. The Industrial Revolution magnified this reach. Steamships, railways, and factories tied the empire together. London became the center of a world economy. And with each decade the empire grew more global, more complex, more entrenched. Part 4, The Victorian Age, High Noon of Empire, 1800s-1900s. The 19th century was the age of Britain's dominance. Under Queen Victoria the empire reached its golden age. It became the empire upon which the sun never set. Britain ruled over a quarter of the world's land and people. India, Africa, Canada, the Caribbean, Australia, New Zealand, vast parts of Asia. Its navy controlled the seas. Its merchants controlled the markets. Its armies marched across continents. There was grandeur in this empire. Railways across India. Telegraph cables spanning oceans. Cities like Hong Kong, Singapore, and Cape Town built into hubs of global trade. But there was also resistance. Rebellions in India in 1857. Wars in Africa against the Zulus, the Boers, the Ashanti. The empire was not uncontested. It was constantly challenged by those it ruled. And yet for Victorians, empire was a mission. A belief in progress, civilization, and destiny. They saw themselves as bearers of modernity. But for those under rule, it was often domination and exploitation. This tension between grandeur and grievance defined the high noon of empire. Part 5, World Wars and the Beginning of Decline, 1900s-1945. The 20th century brought storms no empire could escape. World War I called millions of colonial subjects to fight for Britain. From India, from Africa, from the Caribbean, they marched to distant battlefields. The empire stood united in war but shaken in peace. The interwar years brought new challenges. Economic depression. Rising nationalist movements. And rival empires, Germany, Japan, the Soviet Union, challenged Britain's supremacy. Then came World War II. The empire once again became the arsenal of democracy. Indian soldiers fought in North Africa and Burma. Australian forces battled in the Pacific. Britain survived but at immense cost. By 1945 the empire was victorious but exhausted. Its finances broken. Its people weary. And its colonies restless. The age of unquestioned dominance was over. Part 6, Decolonization and the End of Empire, 1945 to 1997. After the war the tide turned irreversibly. India won independence in 1947, splitting into India and Pakistan. It was the beginning of a wave that swept across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. One by one colonies declared independence. Ghana in 1957. Nigeria in 1960. Kenya in 1963. The Caribbean islands in the 1960s and 70s. What had once been the British Empire became instead the Commonwealth of Nations. A voluntary association of equals. Yet the retreat was not always peaceful. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. The Malayan emergency. The bloody partition of India. These were reminders that empires rarely end without pain. In 1997 the final symbol fell. Hong Kong was returned to China. The Union Jack lowered for the last time over a major colony. The empire was finished. Final wrap-up and cinematic conclusion. Empires rise and empires fall. But few have left such a lasting imprint on the world as the British Empire. At its height it was the largest empire in history. It spread across every continent. It reshaped global trade, politics, and culture. Yet its legacy is complex. It built railways, schools, and institutions. But it also exploited labor, redrew borders, and left scars still felt today. The empire lives on not in territory but in echoes. In language, in law, in sport, in memory. The English tongue became global. Cricket, football, and common law crossed continents. Yet so too did division and displacement. The story of the British Empire is the story of ambition and consequence. Of progress and pain. Of connection and conflict. The sun has long since set on the empire. But its shadows and its light remain. Woven into the very fabric of the modern world.